I have a podcast called Rehash. I co-host it with my friend Hannah, and it's all about internet phenomena that get us all up in arms, only to forget about them within a week. So we rehash them, as they say. We just concluded our 5th season, which is all about what happens when art meets the internet. Is the sun rising on a new creative era, or did it set before it even began? Go check it out. In the summer of 1994, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette published an op-ed by ultra-conservative politician Pat Buchanan called Hollywood Surprise. Hello, I'm Forrest Gump, and I'm a conservative. In the piece, he calls the titular character Forrest Gump a faithful, honorable man, while characterizing Forrest's love interest Jenny, the child version of whom he calls a gorgeous little blonde, as amoral and sluttish, and then calls the leaders of the anti-war peace movements in the movie a sorry lot. When discussing Forrest's time as a soldier in Vietnam, Buchanan remarks that, in Vietnam, Forrest shoots no one. His fellow soldiers commit no atrocities. They are not bitter at being there. They are decent, working-class kids, faithful to their country's call to serve, doing their job. For Buchanan, this was all intentional. Forrest Gump, he argues, though simple and, he uses the R word here, always does the decent, honorable thing. He lives by the golden rule. Most proudly, Buchanan proclaims that Forrest Gump is at its core a conservative film, then ends his diatribe with the question, how on earth did this film get through the PC screeners? And as much as I hate to say it, he had a point.
Those people in Washington behaved as if they did not care.
How was it that a film so beloved by the generally liberal Hollywood elites, which swept up at the Academy Awards, beating out both Pulp Fiction and The Shawshank Redemption for Best Picture, and was the second highest grossing film that year, came to be so gleefully embraced by the far right? As much as Pat Buchanan said that Forrest Gump's conservatism was intentional, it didn't seem that way. Just about everyone who worked on the film, including its lead Tom Hanks, director Robert Zemeckis, and screenwriter Eric Roth, distanced themselves from Buchanan's remarks. Producer Steve Tisch also tried to course-correct during his Best Picture acceptance speech.
All over the political map, people have been calling Forrest their own. But Forrest Gump isn't about politics or conservative values. It's about humanity, it's about respect, tolerance, and unconditional love.
But the damage had been done. Forrest Gump had already been sucked into the political maelstrom. The National Review ranked Forrest Gump in a list of 100 best conservative movies of all time, and also named it the best picture indicting the 60s counterculture. Newt Gingrich spoke about the film during a congressional campaign rally the fall it came out, the same fall that the Republicans won a historical 54 seats and took control of the House for the first time since 1954 in what many deemed to be a conservative revolution.
Overall, it was a Republican victory astonishing in scope, and these new managers promise it won't be business as usual in 1995.
So of course, the overwhelmingly conservative political climate of the early and mid-1990s was a particular hotbed for ensnaring unassuming media objects into the culture war. I mean, look at what happened with Dan Quayle and Murphy Brown just a couple years before.
It doesn't help matters when primetime TV has Murphy Brown, a character who supposedly epitomizes today's intelligent, highly paid professional woman, mocking the importance of fathers by bearing a child alone and calling it just another lifestyle choice.
It was clear the film did not seem to belong to the left. Writing for the Boston Globe, Kehr argued that Democrats should have tried harder to reclaim Forrest Gump as their own, that maybe this would have given them a boost in the election. Even Robert Zemeckis acquiesced in 1997 that the reason conservatives claimed Gump was because, unlike the left, the right had the power of rhetoric on their side, which gave them the ability to circulate meanings about movies. Since then, the movie has only become more detestable to those left of center. There were early detractors, of course. Jonathan Rosenbaum called Forrest Gump the most pernicious movie of the year, and Owen Gleiberman said it was a baby boomer version of Disney's America. But it was really in the following years that the hate for Forrest Gump would really take steam. It made it onto a whole bunch of BuzzFeed listicles like 9 reasons why Forrest Gump is actually the worst. Cracked did an after-hours debate on the film called 5 Racist and Sexist Messages Hidden in Forrest Gump, and esteemed film journal Film Comment ranked it 4th on their list of worst Best Picture winners. Even when I teased this video on my community page, some people took to the comments to proclaim their hate for it. But Forrest Gump is an undeniably well-made film. I loved it when I first watched it as a tween. So, as much as its creators deny it, there has to be something about Forrest Gump that made it such catnip for conservatives, beyond the fact that they're good at co-opting things. Did Forrest Gump have to be co-opted at all, or was it already full of conservative messages to begin with? Which really invites the question, was it actually unintentional? As some of you may already know, Forrest Gump the film was based on Forrest Gump the book by Winston Groom. Groom, who passed away in 2020, was a Vietnam veteran and DC native raised in Alabama, who got his start as a reporter for the Washington Post. He got the idea for Forrest Gump, his fourth novel, after hearing his father reminisce about a slow-witted boy from his childhood whose mother taught him to play piano. He then married this with the concept of what he calls the idiot savant, a socially or intellectually impaired person who exhibits extreme aptitude at a specific thing. Think of Barry Levinson's Rain Man.
Hey, what's your secret, guys? We cheat.
Thus, we get Forrest Gump the book, which tells the life story of a 6'6", 240-pound, intellectually disabled man from Alabama as he navigates the world of 20th century America. The book has often been characterized as a Picaresque novel, a type of prose fiction which William Flint Thrall and Addison Hibbard defined in their handbook to literature as a chronicle, usually autobiographical, presenting the life story of a rascal of low degree engaged in mental tasks and making his living more through his wits than his industry. Episodic in nature, they say, the Picaresque novel is in the usual sense of the term structureless. It presents little more than a series of thrilling incidents impossible to conceive as happening in one life. Forrest Gump definitely functions within this structure. It plays out more like a series of vignettes rather than a cohesive story, and each episode stretches far outside the reach of a regular human life, with Forrest becoming a college football star, a war hero in Vietnam, a ping pong champion who saves Chairman Mao from drowning, a master chess player, an astronaut, and a candidate for Senate. Like a Picaresque, Forrest Gump is expansive in nature. But while Forrest is of low station and definitely alienated from dominant society, he, of course, can't get by on his wits, like the typical Picaro protagonist. Instead, Forrest Gump bears specific likeness to an 18th century Picaresque novella by Voltaire called Candide. Because while the titular character Candide is not intellectually disabled, he is astonishingly naive. Candide is the bastard nephew of a baron who begins the story in a Garden of Eden-like Westphalian castle, studying under the tutelage of an overly optimistic professor, Dr. Pangloss, only to be abruptly thrust into the real world when he's evicted for kissing the baron's daughter, Cunegonde. Candide is a genuinely hilarious book. It's kind of like the original series of unfortunate events, but much, much more violent. Even for an Enlightenment thinker, Voltaire was incredibly ahead of his time, opposing slavery and promoting secularism, both ideas of which he incorporates into this very wry story. Which brings us to another key element of the Picaresque novel: satire. Again, the tone of Candide is very important. While the worst fate befalls just about every character in this story, and poor well-meaning Candide is forced to bear witness to all of it, Voltaire delivers it to us with an air of cheekiness. Because ultimately, this story is a conduit for his Enlightenment ideas, mainly to refute the Leibnizian philosophy that attempts to justify the imperfections of our world by arguing that it's the best of all possible worlds. Candide's tutor, Professor Pangloss, is a stand-in for Leibniz, and over the course of the story, Candide becomes more and more disillusioned with his teachings. At the end, after Candide has witnessed all the atrocities of the world, himself having been flogged, survived shipwrecks and earthquakes, fallen desperately ill, and lost the love of his life to ugliness, Pangloss looks to Candide and tells him that everything bad that has transpired is intertwined in this world, which is the best of all possible worlds. To which Candide, no longer buying the bullshit, replies, "All that is very well, but let us cultivate our garden." A rather progressive message. A Picaresque protagonist doesn't necessarily have to change or grow. They can be either witty or dim-witted, but what is central to these stories is their satirical tone, a focus on the struggle for existence in a hostile and chaotic world. So, in short, these stories are critical of our world, not celebratory of it. And I'd argue that Forrest Gump the book, while maybe less overtly progressive than anything Voltaire would have put out, sees the world in this light. Lots of pretty awful things happen to Forrest. He's bullied from a young age, he flunks out of college, he gets drafted into war and loses the only best friend he ever had, and more. The book is, in Groom's own words, a story about human dignity and the fact that you don't have to be smart or rich to maintain your dignity, even when some pretty undignified things are happening all around you. This could be said for both the book and the film, but what changes is what exactly is portrayed to be undignified. There was a bidding war for the rights to the book before it was even published. Initially, Warner Brothers won the bid, but after Rain Man, they figured they couldn't make 2 Savant movies.
246.
Producer Wendy Feinerman, who was working for an independent company at the time, is the person who really pushed for this movie to be made. And ironically, she ended up in a bidding war with her husband, who worked at Paramount, before the two, along with Steve Tisch, decided to team up and make it a Paramount joint. The episodic nature of the story made it a really difficult one to adapt to screen, but Feinerman asked her screenwriter friend Eric Roth to try and write a draft, which would take him a year. They sent the completed screenplay to Tom Hanks, who immediately signed on, and the film was greenlit for a budget of over $40 million. And it's through Eric Roth that Forrest Gump ended up in the hands of Robert Zemeckis. If you're unfamiliar with Robert Zemeckis, no you're not. He may not have the most distinct filmmaking style, with a filmography ranging all over the place.
And I've finally lost contact with reality. Katya.
From a camp classic like Death Becomes Her,
On guard!
to the sci-fi adventure mega blockbuster Back to the Future, to the dark fantasy comedy Who Framed Roger Rabbit, to the excruciatingly earnest survival drama Castaway, to the source of an entire generation's childhood nightmares, The Polar Express. I'm probably the only person on Earth who actually loves The Polar Express, but what it should tell you is that Robert Zemeckis is a man very, very preoccupied with the intersection between film and technology. If we were to place filmmakers on a spectrum from Paul Schrader dyeing 58-year-old Michael Imperioli's hair black to make him look 19, and James Cameron being the first person anyone spoke to when that submarine imploded, Zemeckis would be right next to Cameron. It's why all he ever does now is those godforsaken, lifeless, uncanny valley collaborations with Disney. But Zemeckis has made a lot of mega hits in his time, and what joins them all together is his interest in history and the concept of time. Aging backwards in Death Becomes Her,
I'm a girl.
the fleetingness of childhood in The Polar Express, or literally riding a time machine in Back to the Future. Back to the Future especially is a predecessor to Forrest Gump, with its emphasis on American pop culture.
My name is Darth Vader.
And an almost Reaganite nostalgia for the 50s. The 80s America that our hero Marty McFly lives in is dirty, pathetic, and full of vice. His mother is a drunk, and his father is a loser, and his siblings are more of the same. It's an America that represents, according to scholar David Kehr, an American dream gone mysteriously wrong. But when Marty travels back to the clean, golden 50s and corrects these wrongs, in this case defeating his father's high school bully, he drastically transforms his future. Now his family is rich and successful, and best of all, he's rewarded for his heroism with the greatest token of American success, a big old car. And of course, Zemeckis tells this story through some extremely advanced technology. Roth once recalled that Zemeckis was primarily interested in Forrest Gump because it required a lot of technological effects, which is no surprise. According to Roth, he said, "You know me, Eric. If this is all dialogue, why would I want to do this?" He's been very vocal about the fact that he thought the film would be a financial risk, which very much informed a lot of his decisions.
Well, I got the screenplay and read it and decided to do it, and I think the reverse was the issue, where when Tom and I wanted to do this and we were trying to convince the studio that it was going to be something something special, because it doesn't have anything that you can easily or comfortably, I mean, it's got to be a studio executive's worst nightmare, because it's like, how do you sell this thing, kind of an issue. They were very brave, and they took a lot of risk to make this film. And I'm glad they did, because we got a chance to do something that's very different.
Neither Zemeckis nor Roth seemed to very much like Forrest Gump, the book. While Winston Groom had been largely kind about the changes they made to his novel, they've been quite disparaging about it. Eric Roth, for example, called the book goofy and farcical, while Zemeckis has gone on record saying stuff like this.
Well, the most dramatic thing was, and by the way, that's a really tough assignment because I never finished the novel. So, good luck. I started reading it and I couldn't read it because it was so bad.
And since the book was so goofy and quote-unquote bad, they set out to give it, in their words, more meaning. So here's what they did. Forrest Gump the film is less like a Picaresque story and more like a coming-of-age for America, a broad survey of the country's 20th century, chock full of signs and symbols from each decade. The book is already stuffed with antics and adventures, but in his technological pursuits, Zemeckis includes a whole number of iconic figures and events for Forrest to encounter. He meets Elvis as a child, he ends up on a talk show with John Lennon, he meets John F. Kennedy at the White House, ironically all of whom die early, tragic deaths for Forrest to innocently remark on, and all of whom are digitally transposed into the film with groundbreaking CGI technology. When asked whether he's a bit of a closet historian interested in turning points in American history, Zemeckis has said this.
No, I'm really interested in, I love history. I love history, American history. I just love history, and I think that, instead of whether I'm a closet or an amateur historian or an amateur sociologist, I think that's what you kind of have to be a filmmaker, a little bit. But these questions are these questions are the hardest questions to actually ask the filmmaker. I can't interpret my own work.
But he doesn't seem very interested in critically engaging with any of this history beyond just referencing it, tapping into our base nostalgia. Forrest Gump the film sweeps across all these major cultural events in a very surface-level way, and that's because of the viewpoint we're watching it from, which is Forrest's. Like the book, Forrest Gump the film opens with Forrest saying something about a box of chocolates, except the saying differs. Book Forrest says to the reader, "Being an idiot is no box of chocolates," whereas film Forrest, sitting on that now famous bench, says that now famous line.
Life was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get.
What you notice from the jump is that film Forrest's saying is significantly more positive in tone, suggesting that life is full of surprises, welcome ones even, like chocolates, where Book Forrest is letting us know that it isn't easy living with a cognitive disability. Like Book Forrest, Film Forrest tells us his name comes from Confederate Army General and first Grand Wizard of the KKK, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Book Forrest says his grandma, who named him, always said they were a bunch of no-goods, whereas Film Forrest shows us some pseudo-historical footage of the KKK, while he tells us in voiceover that they were a bunch of men who dressed up in bedsheets and rode around on their horses, pretending to be ghosts. Both Forrests get bullied in school due to their cognitive impairments, but Film Forrest also has the added physical impairment of leg braces from an unnamed disability. Luckily, though, he discovers he's a really fast runner from being chased by the neighborhood bullies, and in the film, magically overcomes his disability when his braces simply break off. Forrest's only friend is Jenny Curran, who, like her book counterpart, is a pretty girl from school, but unlike the book, is also a victim of childhood SA at the hands of her father. This SA dictates much of Jenny's actions throughout the film. Here's where Film Forrest and Jenny really start to differ. Forrest in the book has a penchant for cursing, has sex, actually a prolonged intimate relationship with Jenny, and is actually impacted by the events around him, however little he understands them. When he's a teenager, he's SA'd by an older female boarder staying at he and his mother's estate, who lures him into her room with a box of divinities. He continues to reference this experience into adulthood. He manages to dodge the draft and go to college by way of a criminal charge against him after people at a theater mistakenly think he's assaulting Jenny. There, he plays football and shows proclivities for various skills, like in math, but predictably, he flunks out due to bad grades. He's devastated by this and gets sent to Vietnam, where he's confused and horrified by the goings-on there. Forrest enjoys certain aspects of being in Vietnam, like discovering his skill at playing the harmonica and later ping pong, and also getting to be there with his best friend Bubba, who he met at college. But he also speaks extensively about the disorganization of the military operations there, and the many terrible nights he spends sleeping in feces after a latrine gets blown up. When Bubba dies, after Forrest tries in vain to save him, Forrest is deeply affected. He begs to no avail to have the sergeant send Bubba home in his plane. And when Dan, the injured friend he makes in the hospital after being shot in the butt, is transferred to a hospital back home, Forrest has trouble believing that Dan is still alive, thinking that everyone is lying to him about it. Most significantly, on a number of occasions, Forrest publicly expresses that he thinks the war is a, quote, load of shit. He even says this to Mao Zedong on a trip to China. Forrest also isn't always good, or perceived to be good within the world of the book. He saves Mao from drowning and gets reprimanded for not letting him die for the sake of America. And while he says that the, quote, colored folks in Alabama are much nicer to him than the white ones, he's also capable of being a bit racist in the way so many small-town, small-minded Americans were and still are. He's especially ignorant towards Vietnamese and Chinese people, as well as the villagers he encounters when a spaceship crashes in New Guinea. Ultimately, Book Forrest is very human. He swears, he fornicates, he does drugs, he has feelings, and he's a realistic product of his environment. Film Forrest, on the other hand, is and does none of these things. He remains a virgin throughout the film, until he loses it to Jenny very late in life, producing a child. He's singularly devoted to Jenny until the very end, as well as his mother, who Book Forrest more or less ignores when she ends up in the poorhouse after their house sets fire. Other than when he says this to Jenny,
I'm not a smart man, but I know what love is.
Film Forrest doesn't show a lot of emotion with regards to the events happening around him. While he's less of a savant than Book Forrest, he excels as an athlete and doesn't flunk out of college, never has a run-in with the law, never does drugs, never swears. Instead of getting drafted into the army, he enlists. And while Bubba, now a black character with a distended lip who he meets in the army, dies in Vietnam, and Forrest is sad about it, he doesn't much bear the signs of any trauma beyond that, instead happily eating ice cream in the hospital while he recovers. Unlike Book Forrest, he's completely unaware of racism. In one added scene, Forrest pops into a televised speech being made by segregationist George Wallace, and instead of focusing on what Wallace is saying, the camera pans to Forrest's confused face in the background. When asked at a peace rally about his thoughts on the war, Forrest doesn't say it's a load of shit. His mic is unplugged right before he can answer, and so conspicuously, he and the film say nothing at all. Jenny, on the other hand, is given a lot more substance in the movie. Almost too much. As Richard Corliss writes in a 1994 article for Time, in pumping up Jenny's role, screenwriter Eric Roth transferred all of Forrest's flaws and most of the excesses Americans committed in the 60s and 70s to her. They turned Jenny from Forrest's dream girl to a different kind of fantasy of the tragic, broken woman. Like I said, Jenny is a victim of childhood SA. She becomes a sort of nudie folk performer at a raunchy strip club. She dates a Black Panther-adjacent civil rights activist who beats her. She does heroin. She attempts to end her life twice. And then, a few later, after reconciling with Forrest and giving birth to his baby, she dies of AIDS. Literally, none of this happens in the book. Book Jenny is a girl who dabbles in the counterculture and occasionally flits in and out of Forrest's life. She does have Forrest's baby, but ends up raising him with her partner upon Forrest's request to be absent from his son's life, quote, so he won't have no pea-brain for a daddy. Whereas Film Forrest raises their son all on his own as a widower. And even though her role is much smaller in the book, she's somehow less elusive than Film Jenny, more human, rather than a male fantasy who exists to emphasize the moral goodness of our protagonist. So what meaning was added here? Well, in flattening Forrest into a pretty one-dimensional, morally pure character, the filmmakers transform him from being a grown man with cognitive disabilities to more or less an idealistic child, a man who maintains his 50s crew cut and infantile worldview for the majority of the film, serving as a symbolic moral core rather than a real character. And by displacing all of Forrest's flaws onto Jenny, who serves as Forrest's entry point into the world of 60s and 70s counterculture, the film creates a hard division between these two characters. Forrest comes to represent the purity of the past, not unlike in Back to the Future, and Jenny represents the hedonism and moral degradation of the present. As much as the filmmakers say Forrest Gump is an apolitical film, their approach to Jenny says otherwise. Unlike Forrest, Jenny is aware of the hardships of the world and the unrest in her country, but she suffers for it. She's lost and flailing. Her hippie partner is an abuser. His friends, the Black Panthers, are portrayed as angry, rambling zealots rather than freedom fighters risking their lives for progress. The counterculture in this film is joyless, pointless, hedonistic, and self-destructive, and its participants are punished accordingly. Where Forrest, who has no ideology,
why are you doing this?
I just felt like running.
And who doesn't change with the times, is a lone survivor. Not only that, when Jenny sleeps with him for the first time, she sheds her hippie garb in exchange for a virginal white nightdress, the ultimate symbol of purity. After her diagnosis, she abandons her life in the city and moves in with Forrest, marrying him and thus securing a nuclear family unit, before dying for her sins. Maybe I'm being dramatic. Maybe all the movie wants to do is to tell us a tragic love story. But when we scrutinize these deliberate changes to Groom's book, it's tough to see it any other way. If you still don't buy it, take the changes made to Lieutenant Dan. In the film, Dan is Forrest's commander whose entire ancestry fought and died in American wars. Dan is injured in battle and saved against his will by Forrest. He loses both legs and becomes a bitter alcoholic who struggles to find work. That is, until he finds God, running a shrimping business with Forrest. In the end, he sports a crew cut, gets a pair of prosthetic legs and an Asian wife, and lives happily ever after. Forrest meets Dan of the books in the hospital, and Dan not only has no legs, but a very disfigured face as well. Dan struggles with homelessness upon returning to the US, as so many veterans do once they're no longer seen as valuable to their country. He doesn't get married or cut his hair in the end, but instead moves to New Orleans with Forrest and an orangutan named Sue. Long story. In the book, Dan spends a lot of time philosophizing to Forrest about life, and teaches him many important things. Namely the idea that we live in a world where the only way to survive is to keep your head down. This goes back to that Picaresque idea of surviving in a hostile world, and it's something Forrest has to learn time and time again, especially when he's already at such a disadvantage. But in the film, it's Forrest who changes Lieutenant Dan. Dan is physically disabled and has a right to be bitter about almost losing his life to an utterly pointless war. And while it's nice that Forrest helps Dan find purpose and fulfillment, his reintroduction to society by way of conformity isn't exactly the most realistic or productive way to represent the impacts of the Vietnam War. It's not a war we should be tying a Hollywood bow around. Forrest doesn't even explicitly learn that he has to keep his head down. The film rather suggests that it's not so much keeping your head down as it is being empty-headed that will help you survive, be successful even in America. That's the meaning they imposed. And what's the result of this? Well, because Forrest is so stripped back, he operates like a bit of a blank canvas onto which anyone can project their own beliefs. Pair that with a rather disinterested, verging on disdainful approach to 60s counterculture, and a bunch of empty historical references, and what you get is catnip for conservatives. Since it came out, there have been accounts of people taking what they see in Forrest Gump as a beautifully conservative film. One poll in 1994, for example, which was definitely not drawn from the most accurate data sample, found that 34% of Americans who voted Republican that year thought that Forrest Gump was a documentary. Of course, we're going to take that with a massive grain of salt, but the way Pat Buchanan and Newt Gingrich latched onto it and managed to sweep the election, a voter base that believes this movie is fact certainly would have served them well. The perceived messaging of the film was so powerful that Michael Connor Humphreys, who played young Forrest, actually enlisted in the army and fought in Iraq, citing that he was inspired by the idea that Lieutenant Dan wanted to die on the field with honor. While the film takes an obnoxiously nothing stance on the war, Wendy Feinerman has said that her proudest achievement of Forrest Gump is that it became a movie of the military, a strange goal for a film that depicts a war like the one in Vietnam. The film may be clearly fictional, but its incorporation of real historical footage through the detached eye of Forrest can operate a bit like what historian Alison Landsberg calls prosthetic memory. Individual viewers of these mass media objects absorbing what they see on screen as events that they themselves experienced, both individually and collectively. Films as iconic as Forrest Gump become amalgamated into an American national memory, as historically revisionist as they may be. In Zemeckis and Roth disregarding the book and adapting it as heavily as they did, they managed to take all of the fast-moving aspects of the Picaresque novel, but removed all of its satire. Unlike Candide or Book Forrest, Film Forrest is no more disillusioned by the end of the film. He's heartbroken about Jenny for sure, but he remains as optimistic, pure of heart, and devoted as he was when the film started. As scholar David Lavery observes, virtually every decision made in altering Winston Groom's novel for the screen can be seen in retrospect as a kind of self-censorship for profit, reconceptualizing of a Candide-like novel, appropriate to the era of the death of irony. What we get is a film that isn't critical of our world, but celebratory of it. It's a film Pangloss would love. Which brings us to why. If Zemeckis and Roth insist their film is apolitical and belong to a generally liberal industry, why did they make their film the way they did? Well, that's obvious. Money. Zemeckis was worried that Forrest Gump would be a financial disaster, so all of the changes he made were in service of creating a movie with as wide an appeal as possible. Rather than alienating viewers with Forrest's flaws, he transformed him into the most ideal American everyman, an aspirationally vacant figure that anyone could relate to. Lavery hits the nail on the head. The decision to alter Groom's Twain-like sarcasm into the film's maudlin folk wisdom was not a literary or cinematic one. It was a marketing decision. All of the decisions made, to scrub Forrest, to inflate Jenny's character, to have them get married, to give Dan a happy ending, to strip all politics out of the film, to reference iconic figures, is to create a romantic vision of America, the perfect Hollywood film. In his seminal book, Postmodernism, Frederic Jameson argues that in our postmodern world, parody has been replaced by pastiche, the phenomenon where a work of art imitates something that came before it, but unlike parody, is reverent of that thing. Jameson describes pastiche as an imitation of a peculiar mask, amputated of the satiric impulse that defines parody. You could certainly say that, in comparison to its source material, Forrest Gump the film is more pastiche than picaresque. Jameson says, the disappearance of history is countered by the attempt to map out our history through images that have no relation to other moments in time, and as a result, attempts to satisfy a craving for history with a product that is a substitute for it. Like I said, Forrest Gump satiates our desire for nostalgia, taps into it. And like Back to the Future, this nostalgia tends to be for a clean, wholesome time before 1960 came and changed everything. In another essay on this topic, Jameson relates it to mass culture. He argues that both modernism and mass culture entertain relations of repression with the fundamental social anxieties and concerns, hopes and blind spots, ideological antinomies, and fantasies of disaster which are their raw material. Only where modernism tends to handle this material by producing compensatory structures of various kinds, mass culture represses them by the narrative construction of imaginary resolutions and by the projection of an optical illusion of social harmony. And that's exactly what's happening with Forrest Gump. In order to construct a happy Hollywood ending and appeal to the masses, it portrays social dissent as pointless and redeems its biggest agent, Jenny, of her sins, welcoming her back into more traditional society. This is so often the problem with popular filmmaking. It assumes the viewer is a blank canvas that needs to be fed and satiated, rather than a person with a specific viewpoint. It makes Forrests of us all in a world that is significantly more complicated than a box of chocolates ever could be.
Stage business. And I just want to focus, White House, China.
Ultimately, I don't think Forrest Gump is necessarily a rotten film. It's just a popular one. Wildly popular. In the early 90s, when product placement was just taking over our screens, Mark Crispin Miller lamented about it in The Atlantic. He says that movies have always used visual trickery to manipulate our emotions, but now they have the appendage of technological advancements that can make this trickery all the more powerful. And they were doing so not only to manipulate our emotions, but to covertly sell stuff to us too. He quotes an ad exec for Pepsi who once said that it wasn't important that the viewer read every scene, just that they get the impact of the message. I'd say the same for Forrest Gump. It's an undeniably well-made, entertaining, and extremely compelling film, sure to have even the most cynical of viewers shedding a tear as Forrest stands over his wife's grave and says this.
I miss you, Jenny.
But its cinematic trickery, conspicuous omissions and perplexing additions, emphasis on the emotional over the social, and romantic sentimentality where there should be satire, is why so many conservatives back then saw it as a mouthpiece. The consequence is that Forrest Gump did have immediate mass appeal, as its creators intended, but in the years to follow, it's aged like milk.
And that's all I have to say about that.
Robert Zemeckis changed Forrest Gump to make it appeal to as many people as possible, but there are some filmmakers who do the exact opposite, who make films that are sure to shed at least half their audience on an initial viewing. My series Taboo on Screen is about these filmmakers, people who shun popular filmmaking to instead explore the ugly, morally gray, and taboo aspects of humanity, and in doing so, attempt to crack open our worldviews, successfully or not. You can find Taboo on Screen exclusively on Nebula. Nebula is a streaming service that's creator-founded and creator-led, which means we get a ton of creative control over the videos we make. Right now, you can see Taboo on Screen, as well as all my past videos, ad-free on Nebula, and you can even watch Nebula videos offline with our app. In Taboo on Screen, we look at films that challenge and sometimes offend our sensibilities, covering difficult topics like whether we should get rid of sex scenes, the films of Todd Solondz, Brooke Shields and the controversy around Pretty Baby, and the wacky world of John Waters. Taboo on Screen is just one of a whole host of prestige, original series on Nebula, made by some of your favorite creators. We're taking the art of video making to a whole other level, and providing a wide range of thoughtful content. You can think of Nebula like Netflix for people who love cultural commentary, and an impossibly wide range of other fascinating subjects as well. If you like my videos, and if you like Taboo on Screen, then you'll definitely love Unrated, a Nebula original series by Maggie Mae Fish, where she dives into the history of sex and sexuality on the big screen. You can also find Be Kind Rewind on Nebula, and many, many of my other favorite creators like Princess Weeks and Patrick Willems. If you're interested in watching some really amazing original content, you can sign up using the link below, and you can support me directly and get Nebula for 40% off annual plans. Then there's lifetime memberships, which cost $300 and last you forever. No tricks, no gimmicks, just you, me, and eternity, baby. Go do it, you won't regret it. So go to nebula.tv/broedeChanel or click the link in the description for 40% off right now. Special thank you to Syed Hassan, Mel Pertwee, Morgan, Cooper Stimson, Nadia C., Nick, Jenny Eller, J. Frost McFinnigan, Gabriel M., The Wiz Daniel, Edward Yu, Andrew Nguyen, Connor O'Keefe, Sharma, Daniel Sardunas, Jenya, Ryan Blythe, Maya Kameva, Naomi Nakagawa, Scott Barnett, Julia Campana, Alexis, Nafis Bullock, Carrie Gavin, RSS, Friedrich Holstrom, Alex Short, and Kelly Wolf for supporting this channel.